Okay, fine. Okay. For more than 40 years, native St. Louis and Dan Martin has been an award-winning illustrator, cartoonist, and designer for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Since 1986, he's drawn the Weatherbird, which can be found daily on the Post front page. The Weatherbird, incidentally, is 120 years old, and that's even older than Dan, by the way. It's the oldest continually drawn cartoon in American journalism. In addition to creating his Saturday editorial comic, Postcard from Mound City, Dan's sketchbook assignments have taken him anywhere from gangster trials to Cardinals baseball. Dan has been honored by the Society of News Designers and the Missouri Press Association, as well as being named to the St. Louis Media History Foundation's Hall of Fame. He holds a BFA in design from the University of Kansas and lives in Crestwood with his wife and son. I present to you my good friend, Dan Martin.
Thank you, Myron.
Welcome.
Before we get started, Myron, I need to have you help me out with something. I want you to ask me a question. And here's the question I want you to ask me. I want you to ask, Dan, how are things in the Post-Dispatch art department?
Hey, Dan, how are things in your Post-Dispatch art department?
Really sketchy.
Oh.
But thanks for asking. Judy, could we go to the first slide then?
Yes, we can. Okay, that's the first slide. We'll
Okay.
that's the introduction. So we're going to go to the first.
Okay. And here's me and the Weatherbird, and here's what it feels like sometimes trying to draw the little guy on deadline. Now, the Weatherbird started February the 11th, 1901 by a staff artist at the paper named Harry B. Martin, no relation to me. So Harry was on assignment out west, and he was riding back to St. Louis in February on a train, and he saw a magazine with pictures of little baby blackbirds across on a wire. And so when he got back to St. Louis, he said, maybe we could have a little bird to go with the forecast every day. So Harry drew about 10 of these, but the next time it snowed or rained and they repeated it, all the readers wrote in and said, no, we want a brand new Weatherbird every day. So that's when the madness started. So from 1901 to 1903, Harry drew the bird, and then he left for New York because Mr. Pulitzer didn't pay him enough money apparently. And he went on to a very interesting and varied career with cartooning and golf. And then after him, there was a fellow named Oscar Chopin who took over. And Oscar was the son of the famous St. Louis author Kate Chopin. And so Oscar drew it from 1903 to about 1910. And then another cartoonist named Carlisle Martin took it over. And he drew it from 1910 to 1932. And then in 1932, he got sick and almost virtually dropped over at his drawing table. And there was a young artist in the staff there that said, ran up to the editor and said, I really want this job of drawing the Weatherbird. And the editor said, well, wait till the body gets cold first. And so that young man was Amity Wolschlager. So Amity took over in 1932 and drew it all the way till 1981. 1981, Al Schweitzer, who's still with us, will be 100 years old this year, took over, and he drew it from 1981 to 1986. And in 1986, I took over. So in Al's last year, he said, I'm thinking about retiring. I'd like to know if you would be interested in the job. And I said, let me think about it, yes. And so we drew, every time Al would go on vacation or leave early, I would draw the bird. Kind of like stepping up from AAA to major leagues once or twice a month. And so when Al was ready to retire, they took about 10 of my birds and about 10 of Al's birds, and we mixed them together. And we showed them to the editor, Bill Wu, who said he couldn't tell the difference. Now, Al and I could certainly tell the difference. It took me about 10 years to get used to drawing it, and I'm still learning things every day. So between 1901 and today, there have only been 6 Weatherbird cartoonists, and 3 of those, Harry Martin, Carlisle Martin, and Dan Martin, have all been named Martin, but none of us have been related. So that's your cliff notes on the Weatherbird history. Judy, can we go to the next slide? And this is basically how I'm doing all this. It hasn't changed a whole lot since 1901. These are roughs and pencils from the Saturday cartoon I draw. It's basically done with pencil for roughs, and then I take a piece of Strathmore drawing paper and I draw it on there and ink it on there and erase all the lines, and I scan it into the computer and color it in Photoshop. Next slide. And this is what I still use. Good old India ink, pen tips. There's something called a micron marker that I use a lot of, and Sharpies, hard lead pencils, kneaded erasers. Now, a lot of colleagues of mine still use this, but probably just as many colleagues do everything on a Wacom tablet. And so they draw on a computer screen. Next slide. And in addition, well, can we go back? This is a drawing I did for one of Bill McClellan's books. We've done 3 books together. Bill and I joined the paper the very first, we joined together in May of 1980 in the same month, and we've been close friends ever since. So this is how, this is called evolving from Bill into a reporter. Next slide. And so for the past 22 years, I've been drawing a political comic strip called Postcard from Mound City. And now it runs in the Saturday paper. And it's online. If you go to STL Today, you can find me there. And it has the past year's postcards from Mound City that I've been drawing from home. So these are just some random efforts showing how this is done. And this is, it's all done pen and ink, and then I scan it in, and all this color in here is in Photoshop. Next slide. And this is going back a few years. This is between when Todd Aiken lost to Claire McCaskill for the Senate race. And he made some unfortunate remarks about rape. And this is him reading about women's plumbing. Next. And this is a friend of Myron's. This is Stan Kroenke. I did for the editorial page about all the wonderful things he's done for St. Louis. Next. And this is the beginning of Donald Trump's term. But Donald Trump has been a great boon to all cartoonists because he's so much fun to draw. And we don't have to read everything through this, but you'll see just some of the caricatures I did. Next. Go back one. This is the Missouri legislature has also been a great source of subject matters for myself and all the other cartoonists in the state. And sort of how backward they are. They're trying to get out of a hole and they can't seem to figure it out. Next. And this was, go back one. This was after the Michael Brown verdict. Next. This is when President Obama was first trying to get the Affordable Care Act off the ground and the website wouldn't work. This is for the editorial page. Next. And this is when they dedicated the new Stan Museo Bridge across the Mississippi, the Stan Span. And I had a great time drawing in a 1940s era Cardinal baseball uniform. I know, Myron, you would appreciate this.
I want to know how you got cars over that.
Yeah. So this is Stan spanning the Mississippi River for the editorial page. Next. This was during Ferguson. The poor girl just wanted to get to class in the middle of all this unfortunate violence and rioting between police and protesters in Ferguson. And this is when the Cardinals beat the Rangers in the World Series in '11. So the ranger has lost his belt and his pants, taken away by a cardinal. That was for the editorial page. Next.
Nope.
This is just a portrait of Donald Trump, probably from his first year in office. The editorial page. And this is considered to be the first American, we'll do a little history now, the first American editorial cartoon. And it was drawn before the Revolutionary War. And you can see this is the colonies, New England, New York, New Jersey, Vermont, etc. Saying that either the colonies join together or they'll die. Does anyone have an idea who drew this first editorial cartoon? No one gets this right, but this is Ben Franklin.
Oh, is that right?
Next. And that was the first editorial cartoon, but really the father of editorial cartooning in America was Thomas Nast, and who was a German immigrant. He was a tremendous draftsman. When he was working in New York, he exposed the corruption at Tammany Hall, at New York City Hall. And the character in the middle here is called Boss Tweed, who was the ringleader of Tammany Hall. And so it's really his campaign that drove Boss Tweed out of office. Boss Tweed supposedly said, my constituents can't read, but they can certainly look at the pictures in the newspaper. And so that's what hurt his reputation. In fact, when he fled overseas to try to escape prosecution, it was one of Thomas Nast's drawings that identified the authorities over there that could recognize him to send him back home for prosecution. So Ben Franklin, the first editorial cartoon, Thomas Nast, the father of American editorial cartooning. Next. And here's a young man, a Hungarian immigrant, who came to St. Louis penniless after the Civil War. And in fact, he had no money to even pay the Wiggins ferry to get across the Mississippi. So he had to work for a day shoveling coal just to get from Illinois over into Missouri. He had no job prospects, but he was very well educated in his native Hungary. He came over here because the Union Army was recruiting immigrants, and he joined up, thinking this would be a good way to a path for success. So when he got to St. Louis, he had all kinds of different jobs. He buried cholera victims. He was a census taker. He went and surveyed land tracts in the Ozarks. He was a Missouri legislator, and he hung out at the Mercantile Library when it was downtown, and he fell into a group of German-American intelligentsia who he played chess with. He was very bright. And that led to a job with the Westlicher Post, a German language newspaper. He became a big star there. And he made money, and he bought the Westlicher Post. And then when he had enough money from all these adventures, he bought the St. Louis Post, combined it with the Dispatch, and became the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1878. So this is Joseph Pulitzer. And when he died in 1912, I believe, the bulk of his estate was left to Columbia University in New York to establish a school of journalism. He also gave money to the University of Missouri School of Journalism, but he gave part of the money to Columbia in New York was to establish the Pulitzer Prizes. So young Joseph Pulitzer. Next. And another fellow floating around St. Louis back then in the 1860s and 70s was a cartoonist named Joseph Kepler, who was an Austrian immigrant. He and Joe Pulitzer became very close friends. He became so close friends that he had no problem of caricaturing Joseph Pulitzer. You can see that's him on the right there. And he's loading up the old creaky St. Louis Post and Dispatch press wheels and equipment. And so Joseph Kepler, while he was in St. Louis, started a magazine called Puck. And it became not much of a success. In fact, it was a failure. But years later, several years later, he went to New York and he started an English version of it. And it became a huge success and was really the first humor magazine in the country. So Joseph Pulitzer, friends with Joseph Kepler, a lot of history of this country's journalism started right here in St. Louis. Next. And that's Joseph Pulitzer as an older man. And of course, Mr. Pulitzer, he had 3 sons that were in the business. 2 of them, he left the New York World, the mighty New York World that he made his fame on, made his money on, and it was the largest newspaper in the country. He left 2 of his sons to take charge of that. As an afterthought, he sent Joseph Pulitzer Jr. out to New York, out here in the sticks, to run his little Post-Dispatch. In reality, the 2 older brothers ran the world into the ground, and his son, Joseph Pulitzer Jr., the second, made the Post-Dispatch a world famous newspaper. Next. And that's another great caricature of Joseph Pulitzer the first. And this is the family dynasty right here. On the wall is Joseph Pulitzer the first. That's a portrait by John Singer Sargent. On the far left is his son, Joseph Pulitzer the second, who really transformed the newspaper and made it into a crusading national newspaper. Joseph Pulitzer the third on the right, who hired me, continued his father's tradition. And then that's the little boy is Joseph Pulitzer the fourth, who ultimately got out of the business, but was an executive at the company for quite a while and was a friend. So these are all passed away, but that's the Pulitzer legend in American journalism right there. And that's the Pulitzer Prize. The highest level of Pulitzer Prizes is the public service one, which usually requires an entire paper's effort to change a law or get someone out of jail or something pretty dramatic. And for years and years, the Post-Dispatch held more of these public service medallions than any other newspaper, including the New York Times. Next. And there's a great tradition of the Pulitzers being interested in cartooning and artwork. This is the first great editorial cartoonist that Joseph Pulitzer hired in the New York World. This is Roland Kirby, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his work. Next. This is the famous cartoonist for the Washington Post, Hurd Block, signed Hurd Block, who would run in the paper when our regular editorial cartoonist, Tom Engelhardt, in the 60s and 70s was on vacation. A multiple Pulitzer Prize winner and one of the most famous editorial cartoonists of the 20th century. Next. And that's Hurd Block at his drawing table in Washington.
Oh, sorry.
And this is another legendary cartoonist from the 60s and 70s. This is Pat Oliphant, an Australian. And he had a different view of the Pulitzer Prizes. He thought they were all phony, at least the cartooning end of it. And he thought, I'm going to submit the corniest, schmaltziest cartoon I can think of. And he says, this will win the Pulitzer Prize. And in fact, it did. And it sort of embarrassed the Pulitzer Committee. And wonder of wonders, Pat Oliphant never won another Pulitzer Prize again after that. This is in the 60s. But he's still considered maybe the single largest influence of editorial cartoonists from 1965 till today. Next. And one of his disciples is Jeff Mcnelly, who's also passed away. And a lot of contemporary editorial cartoonists have been influenced by Jeff Mcnelly, who worked in a lot of different places. And then another one of that generation that's still working is Mike Peters. Does everyone here remember Charlotte Peters? I'm sure you do. Well, this is her son, Mike. So at National Cartoonist Society meetings, no one knows who Charlotte is, but everyone knows and loves Mike Peters. And it's kind of the opposite way around in St. Louis. But Mike was raised in Webster and Dogtown and went to CBC and went to WashU, where he readily admits he was the world's poorest student. And then when he was a boy, the editorial cartoonist for the Post-Dispatch was the legendary Bill Malden. And so since Charlotte Peters was a television personality, Mike was able to go up and watch at Malden's knee how he was doing things. And on Malden's recommendation, he got a job at the Dayton Daily News, where he still is. He doesn't live there anymore. And so Mike has already won a Pulitzer Prize, and he draws the comic strip that we run in the paper called Mother Goose and Grimm. So the St. Louis kid who made good. Next. And this is Doonesbury, one of the most popular comic strips of all time. And we still run the Sunday Dewsbury in the paper. And he won the Pulitzer Prize also. Gary Trudeau, who's married to Jane Pauley. And a more recent, I can't recall the song's band name, but a more recent one, won a Pulitzer Prize. It was sort of interesting and groundbreaking, was this fella. And he won not for being affiliated with the publication, but strictly online. Next. And this is another recent Pulitzer Prize editorial cartoonist winner, and Matt Werker, and he's in Washington. And he's not affiliated. He just affiliated with with a website and no publication. So that shows you how things are changing. Next. And there's the Pulitzer Prize again. Next. And this was the dean of editorial cartooning in the 30s and 40s and halfway through the 50s. This is the Pulitzer Prize winning Daniel Fitzpatrick of the Post-Dispatch. He won 2 in 1926 and 1955. And for years, we still have that painting of Uncle Sam overlooking the country in our offices today. And he was a favorite of Joseph Pulitzer Jr. And at one time, the highest paid editorial cartoonist in the country, Daniel Fitzpatrick. Next. And this is one of Fitz's first cartoons for the paper, commenting on the unsafe railroads. Next. And this is his 1926 Pulitzer Prize winner. And this still hangs in the newsroom or in editorial offices. And it's huge. It's about 3 foot by 4 foot. And commenting on if we would just obey the laws of Moses, we wouldn't have to worry about the laws of man. Next. And Fitz was famous for a series he did called Rat Alley, talking about all the corruption in St. Louis at City Hall. And so this was one of his Rat Alley series. And interestingly enough, one of the Rat Alley series commented on the integrity of one of the judges. And the judges held Fitz, the editorial page editor, and Joseph Pulitzer II in contempt of court and put him in jail for a day. And it became a huge First Amendment issue at the time in the early 40s. Next. And that's one of Fitz's more famous ones, Freedom of the Press. It was done after he was jailed. Next. And he was most famous among the industry as making this gigantic Nazi symbol rolling through Europe. And he sort of became known for this terribly foreboding imagery of the horrors of the Nazi regime. Next. And he also took a long series and swipes at Joseph McCarthy. So this is a Republican rushing toward McCarthyism, a trash can. Next. And this was his second Pulitzer Prize winner. This is in '55. And even then he was forecasting the dangers of getting involved in Vietnam. Next. And after Fitz, this guy came along as an editorial cartoonist at the Post. This is Bill Malden. He won his first Pulitzer Prize in 1945 for his famous Willie and Joe cartoons, working for Stars and Stripes. And then he knew Fitz, and he was looking to get back into, he did a bunch of different stuff after the war, including running for office. And so when Fitz was going to retire, he thought he would be a good replacement. So Bill Malden came in here, and in fact he won his second and last Pulitzer Prize in 1959 for the Post-Dispatch. And then a few years later, Chicago Sun-Times offered him more money, and he went to Chicago. Next. This was the winning cartoon from 1945 for his Willie and Joe series that he won the Pulitzer for. Next. And that's one of his more famous ones, play on cavalry officers used to shoot their horses. Well, World War II cavalry officers just had to shoot their Jeep. Next. And that's one of his for the Post-Dispatch, civil rights demonstrations of violence, and two hillbillies saying, "Let that one go," one of the protesters. He says he doesn't want to be my equal, which is one of his more famous ones while he was in St. Louis. Next. And that's just Adolf Hitler talking to Khrushchev during the Cold War. I picked this one because it's just wonderful drawing. Next. And this was late Senator Stu Symington and Harry Truman talking about the presidential race in 1960. Next. And this was one of his caricature of Chairman Mao as a tiger. Next. And this was probably the most famous cartoon he ever did. This was after John Kennedy was shot in 1963. This is when he was at the Chicago Sun-Times. And he has Abraham Lincoln, the Lincoln statue in Washington, D.C., holding his hands in grief. So he didn't win a Pulitzer for this, oddly enough, but it's probably the most famous thing he ever drew. Next. And does everyone remember this guy? He's still in our paper every day. This is Beetle Bailey, drawn by Mort Walker. And Mort was raised in Kansas City, went to Mizzou for a couple of years, and then World War II got in the way. And they saw he could draw, so they sent him to architectural engineering and drafting school that happened to be here at WashU. So for about 2.5 years, he lived in the women's dorm at WashU, where he learned his craft. And then when I wrote a book about St. Louis cartooning, I asked him to do the foreword. He's been very nice to me over the years. And he did, and he couldn't remember much about what he learned at WashU, but he could remember every single bar in the Central West End. And so Mort died a few years ago. We came back from the war, came back from Italy after being shipped overseas, finished up his degree at Mizzou in journalism. And in fact, on the Mizzou campus, there's a statue of Beetle Bailey when he was still a student, sitting at a desk, and you can have your picture taken. There's all kinds of Mort Walker stuff around Mizzou. He's a proud alumnus, or was a proud alumnus. He's lived up until a couple of years ago when he passed away. He was living in Stamford, Connecticut. Next. And that might be it. This was designed for a School of Journalism lecture I did a while ago. So I guess you can either look at my face, or we can talk about cartooning or questions or anything like that. Does that sound okay, Judy?
That sounds great, Dan.
Okay.
So does anybody have any questions?
I just want to say that somebody might know, ask me how I know Dan. I was obviously with the Globe Democrat, and Dan's been with the Post. Well, Dan also does our artwork for our baseball writers' dinners. And he does things like this. You can see that.
Yeah.
And he's done it every year for us. How long have you done that, Dan?
I think about 12 years. So there was, Amity did it from 1959 or.
Right,
60.
Amity Wallslager did it, and Dan took over, and he's done a marvelous job, and he does them every year. We don't use photographs, we use his artwork, and people take these home as souvenirs, and it's been wonderful. And Dan, want to thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you for letting me step into Amity's big shoes. And of course, all the older guys, we still use Amity portraits for that, because he could, he could draw Joe Medwick a lot better than I can, because he knew Joe Medwick. But all the contemporary ones of the last 12 years, I've had the privilege of drawing. Thank you, Myron.
Quite all right.
Those look awesome. So that's like the program. Is that what you said? It's a program for that.
That's what we use for the program. I was the chairman of the dinner for the last 12 years. And I gave that up this year, but Dan and I have worked with this for a long time, and he's done a marvelous job.
And I think we're going to have it in person again in 2022, I believe. So here's
Exactly.
your chance, Myron, to plug the dinner and have them buy tickets.
You're right. Yeah, it's always the Sunday before Martin Luther King Day. So we're going to be back at it. We missed it last year, obviously because of the pandemic, but we will be back in 2022, and we're in the planning stages for that right now. So Dan, get your pencil ready to draw those again.
I'll sharpen it as soon as we get off the air here.
Susan would like to know, what's the favorite part of your job?
Let's see. Well, I guess I don't have a single favorite part. I like to draw, and they're letting me draw. Maybe the single favorite part right now is I get to work at home. All of us have been working at home for over a year now, and that's kind of nice. About 2 years ago, we're owned by Lee Enterprises now. The Pulitzer family sold us about 12 years ago or so. So Lee Enterprise 2 years ago did what many other large newspaper chains do, is they consolidate their copy editing and presentation teams. So that took away all the individual page designs and layouts that I was doing for the editorial page, and moved them up to the corporate headquarters. So for the past year, I've been also the letters editor. And so if you write a letter to the editor, I'll be the one that'll answer it and edit it and put it in or leave it out of the newspaper. So I was rusty at it at first, but I did spend a lot of time in the journalism school at the University of Kansas. So that's kind of a fun thing I do right now. So I have a good left brain, right brain balance of editing letters, using those skills, and sitting down with pen and ink every evening.
So I have a question on your Weatherbird. So is that how you began with the Post, was the Weatherbird?
No, I came out of the Post straight out of University of Kansas as a staff artist, which meant you drew cartoons, you drew illustrations, you drew all kinds of layouts, you designed pages, you drew maps, you retouched photos, a whole plethora of different chores. And then in 1985, when I was getting ready to retire, I was fortunate enough to step into that. So all this was, I grew up pre-Macintosh. So I have all kinds of arcane equipment in my studio right now that a kid today wouldn't know what the heck they were used for.
So Bill has a question on the chat. How long does it take you to draw the daily Weatherbird and weekly postcard from St. Louis?
The postcard takes about 3 to 4 hours to draw after I get the idea. It's more elaborate and more lettering and the coloring. The Weatherbird itself can take anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. It used to take a lot longer. I can do it in less time if deadline hits. The short answer to that question is the same thing. If you ask a reporter, Myron will verify this. You say, how long do I have? And the reporter will say, how long do I got? And so they'll, I mean, if you say I got 10 minutes to draw the bird, I'll draw it in 10 minutes. If you give me an hour, I'll slow down and do it more detailed, and it'll take an hour. But generally between 30 and 45 minutes.
And you were talking about how long do I have? But
yeah.
I found that some of the best writings I ever did was when I was on deadline and had very little time to do it, and came out with some of my best pieces. And I'm sure that's worked out for you also.
I totally agree. Sometimes we have to use the Willie McGee saying, you're in trouble if you think too much. So maybe if you don't think too much, you can actually turn out your best work. I've experienced the same thing, Myron.
Dan, I've got a question for you.
Sure.
Your ideas for the Weatherbird and for political cartoons and cartooning, the cartoons with a message, are they all original to you, or do people give you suggestions? Or I know the Weatherbird is always connected somehow or other through the daily news. Do you pick that subject out?
I do. Generally, the news editor will send me a budget of what's going to be on the front page that day. The Weatherbird's always connected to a front page story or issue. And so he'll send me the budget and then tell me what photos he knows are going to run large in the front page. And I generally pick which one of those that I want to draw about. And then sometimes I even write the bird line. Most of the time it's a news editor. It used to be the copy desk. But so that's the way that works. And as far as the postcards from Mountain City on Saturday, I submit a rough to the editor on Wednesday night, and then he gives me a green light or no green light on Thursday morning, and I ink and draw that. But those are, and I mean, the editor will make some grammatical suggestions or saying, you should try this, but 90% of the time it's all my ideas. So there's no, one of my favorite questions from school groups is, who gives you your ideas? And I tell them, oh, we have a whole stable of writers who's just providing ideas to me, and all I have to do is draw. And they look up and wonder, and I said, no, that's a big fib, that cartoonists come up with their own ideas, for better or for worse. Anyone else?
I got
I
more
can't hear
questions.
anyone. Can you hear me?
I think, yeah, we can hear.
Okay.
John, did you have another one?
Yeah,
Another
I
question?
do have another question.
Okay.
Your original artwork are works of art. What happens to them?
Well, I have all of them, and I have most of Amity's and most of Al's, and they'll ultimately end up at the Mercantile Library of the St. Louis Media History Foundation. And I have all my original pen and ink illustrations going back 40 years, and all the postcards from Mountain City. But what's interesting, I mean, they'll all be donated to a local institution eventually. Like all of Fitzpatrick's editorial cartoons and all of Tom Englehart's editorial cartoons, who worked at the paper from '63 for the next 30 years. All those are at the State Historical Society up in Columbia, Missouri. But it brings up an interesting thing, John, that the contemporary cartoonists that are working today on Wacom tablets, where there is no original piece of Strathmore with India ink, they have nothing to show for it aside from, you know, a little digital chip. So it's something that people have been thinking more and more about historic preservation and some sort of a tangible, hold in your hand historic link. But the short answer is I have them in the studio, and they won't get dumped on my errors. They'll go to a educational institution.
Dan, I wanted to let you know the original PowerPoint just now came through. So I'm looking at the I think he's the Weatherbird in the porta potty. You want me to at least show them that, and you can elaborate on
Sure.
that? Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Maybe it was just a timing issue. What do you think?
I don't know. That's a
That's yeah.
mystery, Judy.
It was a
Yeah.
big file, Dan. Took a while to get there.
Yeah. Travel time. So there you go.
This is what I have nightmares about.
So can you see the weather? Is that the Weatherbird in the porta potty?
Yeah, this is at Mardi Gras in Soulard. That's not me, by the way.
Oh, okay.
I can assure you that I'll do a lot of things for the Post-Dispatch, but I won't get up in that costume. This is usually the good people in marketing that figure that out. And of course, the Weatherbird has been a marketing tool for the Post-Dispatch since 1901. How are we on time? Would you like to go through some of these slides? Or
Sure, I think we can.
Oh, okay. All right,
Yeah,
well, next. Can you go to the next one?
sure.
That's Abe Lincoln if he were to campaign today. It's a contemporary candidate. Next. You saw that one. Next. Saw that one. Next. This is one of the feature illustrations I still get to do.
Sorry.
For A&E about our fall arts issue. Next. This is when Well, that was with Eric Cantor when he was primaried out of office. This was a baseball one I remember like. This is when the Cards were in the playoffs with the Pirates and the Cardinals making the Pirate walk the plank. It was Birdhouse. Next. That's Mike Shannon I did for the Cardinals quite a while ago. Next. It's a food illustration about pirate food. So I get to do all kinds of fun things. Next. That was for our best restaurants in St. Louis. You've seen Obama. Next. That's another feature illustration I had fun with about all the superhero movies that were coming out at the same time with Batman and Hulk and Iron Man and all this crazy stuff.
So
Next.
Dan, you said you draw these in India ink and then they're colored in with Photoshop. Is that how you said you're doing these?
Correct. I have an oversized scanner right here, and I have one downtown. And so I even if they're too big for the scanner, I can tile them. So as long as I get a black and white, good high res digital image, then I can take that into Photoshop and color them that way. And that's the way. There's very, very few cartoonists actually sitting down with watercolors and Prismacolors and coloring them. It's mostly all done in Photoshop, which
Yeah,
takes just as much skill.
I think you told me that since the pandemic started, you've been doing most of this from home. How many times have you been down to the office since this all started?
Since it all started, I've spent a total of probably 25 minutes in the newsroom over a span of 3 different visits just to pick up mail. So we're slowly easing back into it, and some of us might be coming back in June, but it's been a solid year of working from home.
Bill Livingston asked us so that many of the drawings on the second slide deck aren't signed, and he wondered why.
Normally I just put a DM and the year in it, and that's mainly because on a big feature illustration like this, there's a credit line below it. So it's when it's on the page, it says Dan Martin Post-Dispatch. I just thought a lot of times it's redundant, and to sign it on the drawing itself.
So let's
Next.
see. Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's the Cubs. The Cubs are in town, and this is when graffiti was on the arch. So we're thinking a Cards fan might have wrote something nasty against the Cubs at the top of the arch, and it has to be cleaned off. Next. And that's when Rex Singfield was trying to buy the state of Missouri almost. Next.
There's that one.
Dance band. Next, you saw that. There's Bill, you saw that. Here's some Weatherbirds. I don't remember what the subject was. This is the Weatherbird being cooked alive for something. Next. And that's when a meteor was going to hit St. Louis next, or the Earth. That's the Weatherbird is Lady Gaga. Next, that's one of the Pope's visits or some sort of Pope-related matter. Next. That's the Weatherbird is the Tooth Fairy. Next. About red light cameras. Next. When Bruce Sutter got elected to the Hall of Fame, Cooperstown. Next. There's Joseph Pulitzer, saw him. And this is the beginning of really American comic strips. This is a cartoon. He's known as the Yellow Kid. In the comic strips, when he started at Joseph Pulitzer's New York World in 1896, his name was Mickey Dugan, and he was in a comic strip called Hogan's Alley. So a lot of people pegged the beginning of the American comic strip in 1896, credited with Joseph Pulitzer in the New York World. And at the time, he was in this tremendous famous battle that everyone's heard about between Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And so they were hiring and firing back and forth with each other's staffs. They were both competing to cover the Spanish-American War. There was so much chicanery going on that it became known as yellow journalism. And it all stems from this, the Yellow Kid, the comic strip. Next. And that's the very first Weatherbird in 1901 that Harry Martin drew.
Oh,
Shivering Little Baby Blackbird. Next, that's the Post-Dispatch art department about 1895. In that far left, that's Harry Martin, who created the Weatherbird initially. And the far right, that's Carlisle Martin, who drew it for 20 years. Next. And there's another view of the art department. Nice offices, huh, Myra?
I'll say.
A little cramped. That's Harry in the foreground.
They aren't as not, they're nicer than the Globes as I remember.
Next. And the Weatherbird has been famous really all over. That's some sheet music written about it. Next. There's been songs. It was even in 1912, there was even when Carlisle drew a large Sunday color comic strip about the Weatherbird family. Next. All kinds of promotional items. This one's from about 1902. Little pins. We've had pewter dolls, plush dolls, costumes, stickers, everything. Next. That's Joseph Pulitzer II, Jr. at his desk, probably in the early 20s. At the far right, in the middle, there's a little statue you can see with a top hat. Right there. That's the Weatherbird. So Joseph Pulitzer Jr. always kept a pewter Weatherbird on his desk. Next. All of our airplanes, when they started in the 40s and 30s, all were called the Weatherbird. This is actually the KSD plane with the Weatherbird painted on the tail. That's Governor Donnelly, I believe. Of course, the Post-Dispatch started KSD TV and radio. Next. If you got on the Weatherbird 2, the DC-3s, and then the jets afterwards, this was the symbol that you saw when you stepped on board. It was printed on, this is a playing card, stickers, gym bags, napkins, matchbooks. So that's an Amity drawing of the Weatherbird with KSD and KSD TV. So this is about 1948. Next. This is Carlos Hurd, who was a famous birdline writer through most of the 30s and 40s. So there was lively competition who come up with the bird, the quip that went along with the drawing. But Carlos' equal claim to fame is that he was on his honeymoon in 1912 in the Carpathia as it went from New York to Europe. And then the Titanic sunk, and of course it was the Carpathia that picked up the survivors. Carlos, being the good newspaper man, wrote a long story. They steamed back into New York Harbor. He threw the story overboard to the New York World waiting tug, and it got into the New York World. So the first scoop on the Titanic, first person scoop, was written by Carlos Hurd, appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the New York World, both of Pulitzer's newspapers. Next. This is a drawing that Harry Martin did for Carlos. They were very close friends. And I was friends with Carlos's daughter, Frances Hurd Stadler. And this is a prized possession of mine that she gave me. That's an original watercolor. Next. And that's Amity Wolfschlager, who Myra knows well, on the 50th anniversary of the Weatherbird. That's at his drawing table at 12th and Olive, drawing a giant Weatherbird, 1951. Next. And that's when Al retired in 1986. That's Al, Amity, and myself with hair and a mustache. Next. And of course, everyone remembers the big cake program a few years ago. It dotted all of St. Louis, and they gave me the opportunity to decorate the Weatherbird to the Post-Dispatch cake. So I drew it, made the Weatherbird into a giant cake. Next. We've got a lot of fans, native of St. Louis, Andy Cohen with the Weatherbird. Next. This is my favorite Weatherbird story. The man on the left, his father, George Christensen, was an iron worker in St. Louis. And he was a big, tall, gangly farm boy from Illinois. His pants were always too short. So iron workers give each other nicknames. So he had these short pants, so everyone started calling him the Weatherbird. And so he was the Weatherbird until his son at the left got into the business. So they called him Weatherbird Senior and Weatherbird Junior. So when this man's son was born, that's the guy on the right, was born, George Christensen decided to give him the legal name. So the man on the right's legal birth certificate says George Weatherbird Christensen III. And that's George Weatherbird Christensen IV is the baby there. Next. And this is Elsie Segar, who created the Popeye comic strip. He's from Chester. Next. And Lee Falk, who was raised in U City, went to U of I, married a WashU woman. He created Mandrake the Magician and Phantom, the Phantom, which was the original superhero, predating Superman. Next. There's the Phantom, still drawn today. Next. And that's Lee Falk with Mandrake in live person and the Phantom on the right. Next. This is Al Free, a cartoonist, worked for the Post-Dispatch for 10 years, went to New York and became the single most prolific cartoonist in the history of the New Yorker magazine. Next. Al Hirschfeld, perhaps arguably the greatest caricaturist of the 20th century, raised in St. Louis on Kensington Avenue, went to New York when he was about 12, became a world famous Broadway caricaturist, St. Louis kid. Next. Chick Young created Blondie, was raised in the South Side on Oregon Avenue, went to Hodgson's grade school and went to McKinley High School. That's Blondie wishing the Weatherbird 100th anniversary. Happy birthday. Next. This is E. Sims Campbell, not very well known, but a pioneering cartoonist. His parents were teachers at Sumner, and he went to Sumner for a little bit, actually, where he's more in Chicago, but it had St. Louis, very strong St. Louis connections. And he created a comic strip called The Cuties and became one of the original cartoonists for Playboy and Esquire. Next. And George McManus drew one of the most famous comic strips of all time called Bringing Up Father, who featured Maggie and Jiggs. And he was raised on Washington Avenue and I went to Central High School here in St. Louis. Next. And that's a self-caricature that Mort Walker did while he's at WashU. You can see Brookings Hall in the background. Next. And that's Mike Peters, who drew this for me on the Weatherbird's 100th anniversary. So that's Mother Goose and Grimm and the Weatherbird. Next. And that's, Mike drew a specific strip just for me to run in the place of that day's Weatherbird, Mother Goose and Grimm strip on the Weatherbird's 100th anniversary. So Grimm is saying, I don't mind being stuck here in the rain as long as I'm with my pal, the Weatherbird. And he gave me the original on that. Next. This was Mardi Gras a few years ago, quite a few years ago. Bill and I were judges, McClellan, and then Mike Peters, who saw that last cartoon, was the Grand Marshal. There's a day I had fun. I don't remember anything. Next. Cliff Edwards, born in Hannibal, raised in St. Louis, started his career in St. Louis as Ukulele Ike, and everyone knows him as the voice of Jiminy Cricket. Next. Everyone remembers, all St. Louis remember Arnold Oddities, drawn by Ralph Grazak, who was a longtime cartoonist and boyhood friend of Amity's, and one of my favorite comic strips. And I wrote the foreword to this book that the Post did. Next. A lot of people don't realize that at one time, Walt Disney thought about building a recreational theme park all indoors about where Mike Shannon's restaurant is today. It never worked out, basically because Walt thought that St. Louis ought to pay for it, and St. Louis thought that Walt ought to pay for it. The legendary story is that when they were looking at the plans, August Bush and other senior civic leaders were looking at these schematics, and they said, where's the beer gardens? Where the beer stands? And Walt Disney said, there are no beer stands in my parks. And supposedly Bush said, well, there are no, then your parks aren't going to be in St. Louis. But many of the issues, many of the ride concepts went on to be developed at Disney World. And that's next. That's just a cartoon of the arch with the Mickey Mouse ears. Next. And that's my idea of original cave painting found years ago. Donald Trump caveman hitting Fred Flintstone as a caveman. Next. And there's the old Pulitzer again. Next. And there's Joe again. Next. And that's one of Joseph Puck's drawings. I talked about him earlier. Next. This was another famous cartoonist, worked for the Post-Dispatch, named Robert Minor. At one time, the highest paid editorial cartoonist in the country. He went on, this was a World War I anti-war cartoon. The caption on this that he drew in New York for the Masses magazine was, "At last, the perfect soldier." It's still a very, very famous cartoon today. And Minor actually got out of the cartooning business, became vice president of the American Communist Party. So all of you that you think that there might be pinkos on the Post-Dispatch editorial page, you're almost right. Robert Minor, great cartoonist. Next. And there's Dan next. And there's Dan next. 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 That's what Bill Malden won his Pulitzer for in 1959. Next. And I tell you, this is the first and last time that's going to happen. He was such a nationwide sensation when he was at the Post-Dispatch. And he won that second Pulitzer. They sent a portrait artist to the paper to paint his portrait in his studio. So that's the first and last time a Post-Dispatch cartoonist is going to be on the front of Time magazine. Next. That's one of Tom Mcnelly's great cartoons. Next. Don Hesse. Myron, you knew him, no doubt.
Yes.
Globe Democratic editorial cartoonist. Also in the St. Louis Mini History Hall of Fame. I never met him, but what a great draftsman, great cartoonist. Next. And that's me being choked by the Weatherbird years ago. Next. And there we are at the beginning slide. And I just want to let all of you know that I can say without hesitation that my cartoons are as absorbent as any other cartoons in the country. So
Dan, we're getting
do we want to do
close.
more questions, or I'm in
Yeah,
your
we're-
hands, Judy.
I was just going to say, we're getting close to time, but if anybody has a couple of questions, we're welcome to one or two more. Actually, there was one previously from Susan. What was the best shout out Weatherbird ever got from a famous person? Or at all?
I can tell you that. I can tell you that without hesitation. In the 90s, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg ascended to the Supreme Court, this was nominated and then confirmed, Charles Stix, a famous St. Louis lawyer, was a big fan of the Weatherbird, and we corresponded some. And when Ginsburg got on the court, he asked for the original because he was friends with Ginsburg. He was a big civil rights lawyer and did a lot of work in Washington, and they were social friends. So I happily sent it to him, and I didn't think anything more about it. And then about a month later, I get a letter from the US Supreme Court. It's a handwritten note, thank you, from Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And that's framed and hanging in my hallway about 20 feet from me right now. And so it's a lovely little note, and it shows you what a classy woman she was. And right now I can say that's probably my most prized shout out the Weatherbird ever got.
That's great. That's great. So do we have any more questions? I think Dan, that was really great. I'm glad we've got the second one through, and it worked out, and because we got to see a bunch more of your specialties and the Weatherbird. So we really appreciate you today. Myron, do you have anything else you wanted to add today?
I just want to say thank you also to Dan, and hopefully we'll see each other again at a baseball writers meeting.
If not before, yes. There's got to be a cold beer waiting for us somewhere, Myron.
That's right. All right. Well, you take care. Thanks again, Dan.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Dan. Bye.
Bye-bye.